So welcome everyone to a Metrics 101 course with Katie Kutsko, who comes to us from the American Press Institute. The American Press Institute has phenomenal resources for journalists. They work with tons of different organizations on a lot of different transformative processes. And they have this incredible program called Metrics for News that Katie is involved with, and she'll share more about as well. Katie has been in our network for a long time. She's someone who looks at the metrics and not just looking at how well stories perform in a very traditional sense, but thinks about it in a much deeper way around what's the mission of the newsroom, what are they trying to accomplish, and how will we see signals in a digital sense that that's working. And so Katie's going to take us through today a really great overview, starting with the basics around metrics. And this is hopefully going to help with whatever you're working on your newsroom with, but also just help you understand, I think, as a consumer of media, how some newsrooms make decisions and why the metrics are very important as part of kind of the culture of a newsroom and the direction that they're headed. So with that, I'll turn it over to Katie, who's also in Chicago. We got 3 Chicagoans here today, and she'll take it away.
Hi, everybody. As Jen said, in such a kind introduction, my name is Katie. I work at the American Press Institute. Such a great coincidence that all of us here on the host side are in Chicago. That's a great coincidence. But yes, as she also said, I am here to give you guys a primer on the analytics aspect of data. And I will, throughout this this presentation and session, because it'll be interactive at times, but throughout this whole process, if you have questions, like she said, put them in the chat or just shout it out. There's no need to be overly formal, I guess. But yeah, and thank you all for having me and taking the time out of your day to hear what I have to say. But I'm gonna go ahead and share this. This will help guide some of my intro here. One sec. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the power of audience data, and I do appreciate that that you said, Jen, that we think about audience data in maybe a bit of a more thoughtful way. I do want to highlight that I'm going to be going over a lot of tips that you can take into the newsroom and whatever your role is. And yes, this will help you no matter what your role is. Like if you do something related to audience data in the next 6 weeks, or even in your first job 2 years from now, these concepts should hopefully be helpful to understanding. But just before I dive into this, I do want to give you a little bit of background. She did say, of course, that API we do have quite a few different types of resources, but just to give you a framing, we are a national nonprofit, and our mission as an organization is to advance an innovative and sustainable news industry. And the program that I work in, Metrics for News, we are all about listening and understanding your audience and how they're engaging with your journalism. Because if you're not audience first, especially in 2020, you need to be. We're doing this journalism for the public, and we should do it with them. So API has 4 areas of focus, and we're going to be focusing on understanding your audience today. And we're a pretty small team at Metrics for News. We do have an analytics platform, but I'm there in the bottom middle. I'm the education and strategy manager. And essentially what that means is that I help our newsroom partners with onboarding and learning about basics of metrics, helping you understand how to wrap your head around metrics, because it's very confusing and there are a lot of data points. But first, I do just want to start out by thanking you. Thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to meet with us today. I know someone already mentioned they had classes earlier, and it's just a chaotic time, but thank you. Thank you for applying to provide your service to all of these newsrooms who need you, and they need your time. And I just always want to take the time to thank journalists. It can be thankless at times. But now more than ever, it's important to know what in your coverage is connecting with your communities. Notice that I say communities, not community. No matter if you are focused on a geographical area, or maybe it's more distributed, if you're working, it just depends what news organization you're working at. But there are always multiple audiences because we're not one monolith of people. Everyone is very, all identities are intersectional, and all of our, there's just a lot to it. So if you get away from the idea of being a journalist and you're reporting for an audience, it's bigger than that and more complex and nuanced than that. So kind of keep that plurality in mind. So as I'm sure you're very aware, newsrooms are doing some incredible work right now, but these are things that I'm going to be talking about that newsrooms are focusing on some core audiences, but they're also trying to get new audiences and serve readers in new ways. And of course, they are asking for support, and that's where you guys come in. You're going to try and kind of hit the ground running, and just hopefully they can pass the baton off to you and you'll just jump right in. But you are coming in a support role, and that is kind of the space I feel like I live in, is the journalism support role. So if you find yourself getting stuck, or like what Jen was saying, if you're getting an assignment that doesn't make sense, you can reach out and I'd be happy to help and all of that. I'm happy to share what I've learned in my role in Metrics for News, and also offer other resources that the American Press Institute might have. So if you see something that resonates with you, like on our website or in this presentation, you're more than welcome to reach out and ask for more questions if you want. But now I'm going to dive into a primer on analytics. And this is going to be a 3-part session today. The first part, I'm going to focus on a primer of analytics. The second part, I'm going to give you 3 tips. Basically, like if you just, on day 1, what are 3 things you can just start doing and learn more about analytics. And then the third part, time depending, and this is very loose, but I thought it'd be great if we could just log in. Each person could log into the Google Analytics has a demo account. And if you could just log in there and click around on a few different dashboards, I think that could be very beneficial to all of us, just to refresh and just play around with live data. It always is makes a difference when you're talking about something theoretically versus actually doing it. So just to give you a sense of what I'm going to be going through. But right now, let's start. Oh, also, I do want to mention, I will be sharing a copy of this presentation out with you all. So keep that in mind. You can use this as a reference once you get to your newsroom. Well, I guess it's all virtual, but you get my point. All right, so starting at the very basics, why even use analytics in the first place? We have heard, if we're just reflecting on the state of the industry, there's a lot of mixed messages about which data points to pay attention to, how newsrooms use data to make decisions, how data affects the business, all of this. There's so many different approaches, but I want to share our approach, and I really do think that it's more thoughtful and it's more focused on keeping the journalism priority and the journalism mission first and foremost. So why use analytics? When you combine analytics with your editorial expertise and the organizational values, analytics can be a very valuable tool to provide guidance on what to cover, how to cover it, and how to better serve our many communities. So you could just use analytics, look at the numbers, just to see how many people are coming to your website and all of that. You could use it in a very surface level way, or you could take a step back and try to use analytics to further your mission as a journalist or as a journalism organization. So again, I take the perspective that analytics are directional. Metrics are going to try and signal you into an appropriate direction or help you understand the qualities of a piece of content and why someone engaged with that. It's going to give you guidance. But it's never going to just be the silver bullet that solves all of your problems. I think that's a common misconception with analytics, is that when you log in, it's just going to solve all your problems. It's going to just be a tech stack that helps you understand all these questions you have about your journalism, when in fact analytics are one tool among many to help you have guidance. So I know that not all of you are going to newspapers. You all express different types of organizations, but I do think knowing what your organization cares about is very important. Before you go to your organization, whether it's in a future internship or a new job or just whatever your role is, always just take a little visit to their mission statement and see what the organization lists outwardly as their values and what they care about. See if you can learn a little bit about the business model before you show up. Just know what are different things in this enterprise that they could possibly want to track. And I just think that's helpful, because what you care about as an organization, it should guide what you decide to measure. So as an industry, we used to have fewer data points. Now we have an endless amount. You can track the traffic to your website, the number of likes you get on a Facebook post, or the impact a piece of journalism has in the state legislature. There are so many different ways to measure things and so many different metrics of success. There are just a lot of different ways you could approach this. So I just think that if you start back at the mission and you start back at looking at what are the things that we care about as an organization, that's where you should then go to focus on what metrics you choose to measure. I know I'm talking very generally right now. We'll get more specific, but I think that it helps lay the framework. So another thing that I encounter a lot when I'm talking to journalists about analytics is that sometimes it's very easy to just get caught up in the numbers that are in these fancy charts on these analytics big board screens in newsrooms. It's very easy to just get swept up in that, and to actually, but you have to take a step back and realize that you're asking questions of the data, and you want to make sure that you actually understand what you're even looking at. Like, what does this metric actually mean? So we've already established that the audience is the core of your mission and business. So understand what some of these metrics actually mean. So one way to measure something is to see how popular was this piece of content. A common metric to track popularity is page views. This is going to show how widely a piece of content was read, or how many people viewed a specific page. You could also measure in terms of depth. How much time did someone spend with your content? Some common metrics related to depth are seeing the time spent on a page. How far did someone scroll into the website? how much did they click around on the website? Did they actually just come into your website and then click off? Or did they spend some quote unquote quality time with your journalism on your website? Did they just click on something because it had a snappy headline and an enticing photo? Or did they click on it because it was a topic that genuinely intersects with interests, ways they live their life, and the ways they move around the world? You can also measure social metrics. You can understand the personal connections between pieces of content that you publish, and also the utility of content. So you can start to track things like likes, comments, number of comments, but also that can teach you different things. How many shares is a piece of content getting versus how many people are entering our website to read that story because someone else shared it on social media, like the network effect. How many people are coming to us because someone in their network likes us and shared our coverage. You can also track share rates and all of that. There are just all these, again, I'm just wanting to lay out the basics of what you are even measuring. You want to ask some of these broader questions. It might not literally be you have to ask someone about this, but these are important things to keep in mind. Also, maybe you are measuring a segment of your audience. That is a specific audience or specific audiences that you want to track or measure. These could be people who live in a local area. Maybe they are loyal readers. Maybe it's people who are coming back over and over but haven't subscribed. Perhaps you want to track just a set of subscribers, your set of logged in users, maybe a specific age group. Again, I'm just providing you with some examples of, this is kind of like the translated, like we're looking at, it's very common for a lot of news organizations to, for example, look at page views. But I just wanted to explain that, yes, a lot of newsrooms will look at page views, but what does that actually mean? You're looking at how widely a piece of content has been read. And depending on the type of organization you are going to, that kind of depends on how, or depending on the newsroom you go to, that will more or less determine how valuable that metric is. It's different every newsroom you go to or talk to. So this might look different in practice for each of you. So I'm going to keep going with this glossary of terms. So back here, we were just talking about largely these buckets of ways you can measure. You can measure the popularity, the depth, the social connections of a story. You could measure specific segments of the audience. I do also just want to make sure that, again, we're being very clear about definitions of metrics. But my tip personally is to understand, first of all, choose the metric you want to analyze, but understand what the definition of that metric is, and also what the audience that is being measured is. So always keep your audience top of mind. So that's why right here on the screen, I have it organized by the metric you're looking at, which audience are we measuring, and then what is the definition of that metric. I think that's very important because consistency matters. If you are all working off of different definitions of a metric, that leaves room for error in analysis. So again, that's just a piece of advice. Always keep in mind what is the definition that we're working off of, because it does differ platform to platform. So that's something to also keep in mind. I'll get into the differences between the platforms here in a second. But do keep in mind some of these with metrics, precision is important. So understand when you're talking about metrics, there's a difference between the average number of page views and the total page views, or understanding page views versus read time. These are some basic, I'm going to give you basic terms and definitions here, but I do just, again, keep that in mind. Keep in mind the metric you're looking at, the audience, and then what is our definition? Because it might be different platform to platform.
Katie, I'm just going to jump in here to let you know, we just had a new person join, Cam joined. So welcome, Cam. We've just been diving into some of the background, which you can catch up on in the recording. But I wanted to pause too and see what questions do y'all have so far, if any?
I guess, what did I miss?
That's probably going to be best done afterwards. We'll share the recording so you can see the first like 20 or so minutes of the presentation. But Katie, do you want to do like a quick summation of just what
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, hi, Cam. I'm Katie, and I work at the American Press Institute on our Metrics for News analytics platform. So far, I'm just giving a very basic primer over some terms and just how newsrooms typically talk about measuring either the success of a piece of content or how a particular segment or segments of their audience are engaging with those pieces of content. So that's kind of where we are. We're just at the beginning still, but this will be a 3-part training session. Part 1, I'm going to be going over these basics with you all. The second part, giving you some tips and questions you should ask of your manager when you are starting in your role. And then finally, we'll just log into the demo account of Google Analytics and just play around, get your hands wet, and ask questions. So far, that's where we're at.
Perfect,
And
thank you.
Yeah, of course. I just also, Jen, I haven't been monitoring the chat. So, okay. No worries. I was just making sure there were no other questions.
All good. I'll keep an eye too if anything comes up. Yeah, any questions too from folks who have been hearing what Katie's shared so far? Anything confusing or?
I have a question about the 4 different types of metrics that you mentioned between like social, depth, breadth, and then segments. Do you think that either of those 4 are like overlooked more than others as an industry?
That's a great question. I would say that it differs place to place, but as an industry, we've probably focused on popularity metrics or a lot. I think personally, I don't think that any one metric matters more than another. I think that they all have their merit. You just need to understand what exactly you're measuring and why. So I think that to answer your question, that maybe we've focused a bit too much on popularity. That doesn't mean it's not still important to understand how widely content is being read, but that's not the only thing we should be focusing on. But I would say that newsrooms are definitely getting better at tracking this, but I still think that segments are something that not every newsroom is necessarily looking at. Segmenting the audience.
And I wanted to add something right there that we'll probably talk about at the end as well. You may, after this training, be coming into your newsroom with more background and grounding on metrics than your colleagues will be at the newsroom that you're working with. So just keep that in mind. And you're welcome to share this deck and the recording with them as well. But this isn't something that every newsroom has gone through or has talked about the definitions and the importance of. So just know that you might be coming in more equipped to talk about these things.
That's a very good point, Jen. Just keep in mind that you guys are being put, first of all, it's an amazing opportunity, but it's also a challenging role that you guys are being put in to just kind of drop into the middle of a newsroom that is probably running around like chickens with their head cut off. And they might not have gotten training in some of these things. So when I was saying at the beginning, like keep this deck and refer back to it if people talk about metrics and you're confused or what have you. There's not one right way to do things, but just keep in mind that you might be getting a bit more training on this than some of your other colleagues will have. So if they don't have the answers to your questions, they might not know, or that might not have been talked about there yet. That's a really good point. And that was a good question. So getting back to that glossary of terms, so just keep in mind, I think these are some of the more common metrics you're going to hear about. Average page views, average read time. This is the average page view is just the average number of page views per story. Again, that is, you're talking about total readership. We're not across the whole audience that you reach. I do think that if you are, let's say you're just starting on your first day and they give you a login to Google Analytics, I think that if you're just trying to orient yourself and get your head wrapped around like what types of content performs well and that kind of thing, I would start looking at averages first. Because if you start looking at averages, you can understand what's quote unquote normal for your journalism. Whether you're looking at the average number of page views of people actually clicking on the web page that the article has been posted on, or the average number of read time, depending on whether you're looking at minutes. Here I've just included minutes, the average number of minutes each reader is spending with a story. Find the averages at first just to see what is normal. That would be my piece of advice. Also, I think these social metrics, you'll probably hear people talking about average shares. Facebook and Twitter users who are coming to your journalism when something is shared on social, again, just start by looking at the averages, see what's normal, and then I would go from there. But you're going to be coming in at a point where people are already in the middle of things. So I would just focus on that. Also, this matters depending on where you're working, but I included the average metro social entries as an example. But looking at referrals and where people are coming from, the organization maybe cares about social entries, or maybe they just care about any type of referral device or platform referral. It just depends on your organization, but these are a couple more very common metrics you will hear about. Who is sharing our stuff on social media? Who is coming to us through social media? That's probably something that they'll care about. And if it's not social media, it's probably newsletters or talking about your subscribers, things like that, which we'll get into in a second. Also, I think this is an important thing for you to have just even heard about. People probably aren't going to talk about it this like this, depending on the newsroom you're going to. But if you're going to be in some type of data role, it's just good to know what a content taxonomy is. That's like when you are, essentially it's like the data structure in the website. So just to know what it is would be, I think, good enough at this point in your learning stage. But basically the content taxonomy is from the publishing standpoint on your website. Those are all the things that right before you press publish, those are all the things you check, and like adding tags and all of that kind of stuff. This is how that's going to allow you to better measure the success of your content, is having a data structure set up. That is commonly called a content taxonomy. I don't think that's something you are going to have to think about or deal with. Just know what it means when someone talks about it. It can help you to understand why people are engaging with the journalism, because you're able to compare like things to like things, like different content types. But I don't want to go too deep on that. I just want you to have heard the term. Right now, I do want to just take a pause, take a breath, and in the chat, I would love to just, whoops. I can look at the chat still here. I would love to, a couple of questions here. First of all, if you guys have questions so far, you go ahead and just say it out loud. You don't have to put it in the chat. But if you don't have any questions, there are a couple. I am just very curious how many of you guys have used metrics before, or an analytics platform, and if so, what metrics did you pay attention to? And then also, I'm very curious just to talk to you guys before we'll just keep going, but I also wanted to know how you plan to be audience focused in your new role. I know that's maybe a hard question to answer if you don't know the exact roles you'll be in, but I'm curious. I just wanted to know if you guys have experience with metrics at all. Open-ended question. You guys are all, it's a small group, so. Have any of you guys used metrics at all? No? Oops, I keep like.
I helped run a podcast and blog in the past, and help sort of look at what type of content, like whether it's related to a podcast, has had higher page views than standalone blog pieces, and that definitely helped us, I think, inform some of our decisions.
I see also Cam put social and page views. I'd say those are very common ones. It makes sense that you guys have experience with that, or you've heard it. Well, even if you don't have an answer to these questions, I would just make note. How do you plan to be audience focused in your role? I know that the goal is probably to best support the journalists, but it's kind of meta, but I would just keep that in mind as we keep going. I did just want to take a time to pause and let you guys ask questions if you have any, but I'll keep going. Now I'm going to go over some of the more common tools that newsrooms use to track analytics. The first one I'm going to touch on, of course, is mine, Metrics for News, our tool. This is, I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but by chance that the newsroom you're going into has Metrics for News, you will be able to have heard of it. This tool is not a real-time analytics tool. It is a strategic tool that aggregates data from multiple sources and combines metrics into what we call engagement scores. All right. But you're more likely to get into a newsroom that is using this tool, Google Analytics. So this is probably the most common analytics platform. Every newsroom, most newsrooms use Google Analytics at the very least. This is where you can get some basic website data collection. It's not super focused on like data over a period of time. Most newsrooms use Google Analytics in a real-time capacity in the sense that I mean they're focused on using this tool on a day-to-day basis to make decisions about where to publish their journalism, which platforms to distribute it on, like are we going to put it on social media, in a newsletter, all these different strategies they could choose from. But Google Analytics is very powerful because it allows you to do some of those custom audience segmentation, like that we have been talking about. Things like, is it a millennial? Is this a millennial reader? Or is this a repeat reader, someone who's coming back, very loyal? Of course, with Google Analytics, there's the value in integration across Google products. So that's also a very useful element of Google Analytics. You can compare some of the data you're seeing against local Google Trends data, or even like the Search Console. Like if you are tasked with SEO, something related to SEO tags, you can match that up with metrics and data that you find in Google Analytics. But Google Analytics has a heavy focus on page views, which isn't necessarily bad. It's just something to be aware of. So this is probably the most common tool. Yes, SEO equals search engine optimization. Yeah, if I'm going too fast or breezing over things, don't hesitate to yell out because I'm throwing a lot of information at you guys. Another very common tool that you might come across is Adobe Analytics. This is also, it's formerly known as Omniture, but I think their official name now is Adobe Analytics. And this is probably only something you would come across if you go to a big corporate newsroom, because it's a very expensive tool. But it has a bunch of different plans available, but it's a super complex tool that has a digital marketing focus. It's known for having pretty good historical data reporting capabilities. Historical data meaning you're going to be looking at a lot of data points for your journalism over time, rather than looking one day at a time. It's a good tool since it does have a marketing approach. It is good for building profiles and like audience profiles or personas. But again, I don't know how likely it is that you would interface with this tool, but I still think it's important to know what it is and know that it might be something your newsroom is using. Chartbeat, other than Google Analytics, I'm going to guess that this is one that most of you will get to see in some capacity. This is probably one of the most popular real-time tools that newsrooms use. I would say the big board, the big board metric that is important in Chartbeat is what's called concurrence. These are active people who are visiting your website. And that's over here on the left. Like you can see there are 24,000 people on this sample website. And they also, Chartbeat has a pretty well-known like screen overlay feature called heads up display. And essentially what that is it's this display that goes over like your working view of your news organization's website, and it will tell you like who clicked on which buttons on the website the most, how far people scroll into the page, and things like that. That's called that heads up display. And also, sorry, I was reading the chat. There is a dashboard in Chartbeat for historic data, but I'm pretty sure it's only for 30 days at a time. So it's not, again, it's not an emphasis on historical data. We're looking at a lot of real-time data in a tool like Chartbeat, because you would use this tool. I'll get into this here in a second on how you decide which tool to use. But you would use Chartbeat to make a decision about where to put a certain story on your homepage of your website, or which headline to use. Chartbeat has the ability to do what's called A/B testing, which means you could run basically an experimental test to see if headline A performs better or worse than headline B. And that is like a live tool you can use, and Chartbeat offers that functionality, which can, I know a lot of newsrooms do use that. I don't know if you in your role would need to use that, but I just think that having an understanding of all of these tools, audience data is very fragmented and it's all over the place. And if you can at least start to understand what might be all of these different tools in your newsroom's toolkit, you'll start to understand how their overall goals fit into the mission, and you as an individual, how do you fit into that? So it's important to understand as much as you can about the strategy, even if you're not a decision maker. All right, another common analytics platform that you might encounter is called Parsley. This is a blend of real-time and historical data. Parsley has predefined identified some key metrics. They focus on page views, engaged time, and loyalty a lot. This tool organizes the dashboard by authors and posts, and it's not by URL. That's Google Analytics is not the most user-friendly tool because it organizes all of the website pages by URLs, so it's not very friendly to look at, but it's useful and it's something that you might have to look at. But again, this is Parsley. It's unlikely that you would directly need to work with this tool, but again, important to keep in mind. Many newsrooms, especially newspapers, care about tracking a paywall meter or a hard wall. It depends on the newsroom's business strategy, but a paywall meter is the software that tracks how many times you come before you hit your fifth free New York Times article of the month. That is a paywall meter that's tracking how many times people are coming back. And Piano is one of those platforms. It allows you to more or less track a user journey or see what content is prompting readers to convert to subscribers. Again, that's just another tool you might come across, tracking how many people are seeing the meter. Another platform you may or may not come across is MailChimp, or another newsletter platform. these types of tools allow you to organize contact data and track and segment your audiences based on a bunch of different metrics, but you can send messages based on the audience data that comes from this newsletter platform. And of course, it's a great way here within the platform to just track referrals, which newsletter or post is bringing people back to our website. And again, this is useful in terms of developing an audience or trying to retain an existing one. And there are, again, so many different tools that you could be using. It's hard to sometimes determine how you would choose what, but again, here you'll also have out of your own website, you have some like off-platform metrics. You can look at social analytics. Facebook and Twitter have insights directly on their website, but if you want to look at Facebook and Twitter insights, as well as Instagram and Reddit and YouTube analytics, you can also go to CrowdTangle. That is another very useful site or analytics platform. Again, you can look at some of the same types of metrics, but I just think that it is important to understand when you're looking at social metrics, the social platforms that we use, the big ones, at least for news organizations, some of the bigger ones being Facebook and Twitter, those platforms are designed to keep people on those platforms, not to bring readers to news websites. So a lot of the metrics will be that you might focus on would be related to referrals and how you're getting someone to your website. But that I would say when it comes to social analytics, I would, whoever is in charge of the social media strategy, and that probably differs a lot depending on the size of the organization, because you might go to a place that has a whole team devoted to audience development and analytics and reading social metrics and all of these things, or it might be one person's job, or it might be nobody's job. It might be something that's spread amongst a lot of people. So I would just see what the structure of your organization will be like. See who is kind of the gatekeeper for which data points and which strategies, and talk to that person and ask questions. Because it's going to differ a lot place to place. And then, of course, those were all of the software platforms that are common across news organizations in terms of data collection, but there's always qualitative data as well. Other ways to listen to your audience, other ways that I'm sure Harkin is sharing in all of your other training sessions. There are many other ways to listen to your audience. Data is one very anonymized aggregate way to look at the quantitative data related to your audience, but you can also get other data points. And it depends on your newsroom. Some newsrooms do a lot of this stuff. They'll do surveying of their communities, focus groups or reader advisory panels. Some organizations will do design thinking to develop personas, or they will just have a whole news sites based off of different personas that have been created. And if you're not familiar, a persona is essentially like, it's not always based on, it's like an anonymized persona of like a sample reader or a target audience. And a lot of news organizations will have that data available, And then, of course, tools like Harken provide a whole different type of data. And you get the audience questions. Like that's a very different type of data point than who read a story. They're very different, and you could use them in different ways, but it's still a way to listen to your audience. And again, just pointing out some of these basic things that your newsroom may or may not have this data available, but different newsrooms are using this type of data. And when I say a survey that moves beyond conventional market research, I mean asking your audiences questions about their lives and how they live their lives, not just asking them what they want to see in the local paper. Asking these types of questions. A lot of the qualitative data, you can also, if your newsroom's not formally collecting some of this feedback, you could talk to people in your reporting and get some of the answers that you might get in other ways at a bigger newsroom. That's another thing to keep in mind. There might be other processes in place. It just depends on the newsroom, as I've said a bunch of times. So bringing it back after we've just talked about the different platforms, web analytics were never journalism analytics. Conventional web metrics were created to measure web pages. So that's why it's a page view, time on page. Those are all of the metrics, but even though they weren't designed for journalists to use, you can still learn a lot from them. And so I want to point out some of the questions you can start asking. So you can still learn a lot from the metrics, especially if you understand your organization's overall mission and business model. I know that's a lot, and I've thrown so much your way, and it's a lot to ask someone who's dropping into a newsroom for 6 weeks to say, hey, you should understand the organization's mission and business model. That's a lot to ask, but it's important. If you are able to have a basic knowledge and wrap your head around the business model in a very basic way, like, I mean, you should know if the organization cares about if they're advertiser supported mostly, or if there is some type of reader model where there's a subscription or something, because you will look at metrics differently depending on the business model. So at the beginning, Jen was saying that this would be a good session to attend even if you're not a journalist, like even if you're just a person in the public. And I think that's very, very true, because I think there's a conception that journalists, like the more clicks a story gets, the more that journalist's paycheck goes up, or the more clicks directly correlates to dollars. It's not always that cut and dry. So I think that keeping some of this stuff, knowing it will help you. So we take this approach that metrics provide a signal. They are directional. So earlier on, I said that when it comes to data, accuracy, of course, and precision, they matter a lot. But I will say something you should keep in mind is that metrics differ platform to platform. So like, that the way that Google Analytics measures time spent on a web page is a different count than the way that Chartbeat measures how time is spent. Sometimes that can be confusing because it feels like the data is not accurate, or it's hard to trust because of that. I just always advise people to keep in mind that that data is directional and that it's a signal. It's going to point you in the right direction, but it's not accounting. I attended an O&A session last week, and the head of analytics for the New York Times made that point again, which is such a good reminder that analytics are statistical. They're not an accounting measure. So it's just going to show you things that are directionally sound, like you need to basically be going in the right way, but it's not going to lay out point by point what there's still guesswork involved is what I'm saying. There's, I think that metrics and measuring things, that's definitely a science, but finding the audience insight is a bit of an art, where there is the hard data there in front of you, but you kind of have to use your journalism chops and your local context, and you have to combine that with the signal that this metrics, a signal that the metrics are giving you. So analytics will help you test and improve your judgment, surface things that are very valuable to your audience, help you make better decisions, help you measure things that matter, but it's never going to just be prescriptive or tell you what to do or build or execute a strategy for you or measure everything that could possibly matter. I just think that it's important to keep in mind, what do you want to achieve and what is the question you have? And the tool should hopefully be able to point you in the right direction. So use analytics to answer your questions. So here, I'm going to start with some of those questions. Convert web analytics into what we call news analytics. So start with a question and make these analytics actionable rather than just looking at a bunch of numbers. Ask what topics or beats perform best with our users. I put users because it could be reader, listener, viewer. How can I learn about my own pieces? If I'm an author, how can I improve the engagement with my content? Engagement might be sort of a tricky word for me to be using, but I just mean, how can an author improve the interaction that the audience interacts with their content? Are stories about candidates or stories about the process of elections driving more engagement on our website? That is a question about the quality of your journalism or an angle that you took. What difference do headlines make? How can I improve a headline that I write, and will that lift the engagement metrics across the board? Again, analytics are very experimental. You start with a question and the data might tell you X, Y, or Z. So what topics or beats perform best with certain users? And then the data will tell you that all segments of your audience are interested in reading different topics. So your overall online audience might have a different preference than social users or a certain age group, like 18 to 24-year-olds or newsletter readers. I would say, what are those key segments that we care about? And then what is working best with each of them? Next in that question, how can a given author improve their engagement? Review the qualities of your journalism. You could look in the data and see, do the stories, again, this is going on the angles. Is a story I write about mail fraud more getting, is it performing well against the key metrics that my newsroom cares about? Or do stories about mail security do better? Again, it's a question about framing, and you can't necessarily track sentiment. Not everybody is going to be able to have tools that track like natural language or sentiment or emotions, but if you're looking at the qualities of your journalism, that can help you understand more of the angles that you could take. You can also ask a question like, are stories about candidates or the process of elections driving more engagement? And you might look in the data and see, oh, local candidates perform higher with our newsletter readers, as opposed to if you're covering a national, like if you were covering a debate, you might not put that in a newsletter if the local candidates perform higher. Like that's an example of a decision that you can make using data and using analytics specifically, because you would use data, and your other sessions in the week will definitely give you many other ways to use data in your actual journalism. And if you want to know what difference do headlines make, let's say, for example, you have access to Google Analytics. You can compare a list of recent stories, those stories that have recently been published, and you can compare it to Google Trends or like the search console, or it just depends on what your role is and what they're asking you to do. But you could also run a test. Like if you want to know what difference do headlines make and they have Chartbeat, you could run headline tests. It just depends which metrics are available and what you have access to. But I do think that it's always important when you're looking at metrics or any type of analytics, start with a question first. When you log in, try to answer one question, interview the data like it's a source. Another piece of advice that our product and technology manager at Metrics for News said this last year, and it was a very good point. You would never write a story with a single source. So why would you analyze the success of a story with a single metric? There's always more, basically, if you're just looking at one metric, you're like flattening the complexity of the story or issue. So now going into part 2, 3 things. Yeah.
I had a quick question.
Go for it.
On your, and tell me if you're going to get to this in a bit, Katie. Since we have folks who are working with broadcast news, newspapers, et cetera, and digital outfits, would you be able to characterize kind of what the metrics du jour are for those main outlets? Like what broadcasters tend to pay attention to, what newspapers tend to pay attention to, just so that they might have an idea entering their newsroom what metrics are already popular and valued there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to get to that in a second, but it's not, I didn't lay it out as directly as like, what do newspapers care about? What do broadcasters care about? But I'm going to answer that about right here. So I think that the first thing that you should do when you start is try and get some time on the calendar with your manager to just talk about goals for your role and how to measure success. I'm going to get into Jen's question here in a second. And this is why I keep saying try your best to understand the overall mission and also business model of the place you're going, because everybody has a different strategy. Every single organization, even if you were all going to the same the same chain, and it was different publications, but they were all owned by the same people, you would still find different priorities and strategies at each place. But this is why you need to communicate with your manager, because you don't want to have a bad taste in your mouth for metrics if they're using them in a different way than maybe you want or would hope for, but we still need to use metrics, even if it doesn't necessarily align with how you personally view metrics or so on and so forth, but try to use the right metrics to offer data-informed recommendations. Okay, so here, this is where I want to relay this back to the question Jen just asked. It's always important to ask your manager, what are goals related to my role and how will we measure them? Because different people may have different KPIs. That is a key performance indicator. And that's if you've never heard that term, it's more of a quote unquote businessy term, but you're just deciding what are the key metrics that we as an organization care about and which metrics matter to my role. And if you're asking that up front, that should be helpful. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is in your question about what metrics to broadcasters versus radio versus newspapers. This is a very common strategy, especially at newspapers, this concept of the audience funnel. And it might, no matter where you work, I imagine that they care about an audience funnel because there are different metrics that you should pay attention to depending on what stage or level your audience is in or the segment is in that you're caring about. So essentially the idea with an audience funnel is that you could start with like the pool of potential audience gets smaller and smaller the longer they know about your website or what have you. So an audience funnel, you could start with anybody possibly on the internet could come across your website. And then they read one thing and they're like, oh, this is pretty good. I'm going to come back. And then they come back and eventually they decide to pay for something and become a subscriber. And so again, there are different metrics to pay attention to or different strategies because you can measure different things at different stages. Like a casual reader or somebody who is more at the top of the funnel, as it is called, or a casual reader, that's when you might be paying more attention to total page views or social referrals. Then if someone is coming in and they come back to your website a few times and they're more engaged, they're in this group of engaged readers or engaged users. And maybe you would pay attention to metrics more related to total time and page views per user. You're getting, the strategy is less generic and more focused on loyalty and getting people to stay longer and longer. So those casuals are more of those popularity metrics like we saw, the totals and the social. This engaged segment right here, we're focused more on depth. And loyalty, you might be looking at meters or conversions, people going into a subscriber. And again, that's why it's important to ask what the goal is related to your role, because there might be different key metrics that matter for different people, because you might be working on things that serve different levels of that audience funnel. So an example, this is a good example. So there are lots of different types of journalists who work at the Washington Post, many different teams. The morning mix team is one team that is They do a lot of aggregated posts. They get a lot of page view counts, and they have a high story volume. Like, they are a team within the Post newsroom that is really trying to bring in that top of the funnel audience. Those they're just trying to get anybody on the website. And then the investigative reporters and those local teams that really add that editorial value to the mission of the journalism enterprise. They're expected to serve loyal readers and convert subscribers because they are focusing on the type of content that would be probably down here, the loyal and subscribed people. They are spending more time on the website. And so this is an example of different roles have different KPIs or key metrics to care about. And again, I just want to point that out. So I don't have a list of key metrics that will matter across different types of organizations, but I will say this: if you are working at, no matter which organization you're working at, the metrics that they most likely have are going to be measuring their website. So I would just talk to your manager specifically if they have metrics related to radio or broadcasting on the actual radio platform or the TV. Otherwise, you're just going to be looking at website analytics for their websites, and those metrics that I mentioned related at the top, like page views, time spent, the social sharing, and social entries, those are probably some of the most common metrics across all types of news websites. However, the specific organization might have specific metrics that you should ask about. So that was my very roundabout way of answering Jen's question. And I know that it sort of sounds like a cop-out answer, but every newsroom truly does something different. Number 2, so first, talk to your manager, find out what the goals are related to your role and how they intend to measure that. And then number 2, find out what tools your newsroom uses and how you can access them. Because unless you're going into, I don't know, it might just be based on the manager's personality, but I'm going to assume that it's unlikely that they're just going to have like an orientation packet ready for you with all the logins you'll need ready on your first day. So if they don't have that, ask for it, because they're very busy and they just need you to ask for logins. So you want to know what they have and how you can access them. So I would start again with this: get logins and then ask, what are the KPIs I should pay attention to? KPIs, again, key performance indicator. Do I need to pay attention to time spent or a specific audience segment for my work or my team or the organization as a whole? Are we working towards any election specific goals? Is there something very specific to a voter guide that we're writing or something related to mail-in ballots? Is there something specific I need to know? Do I need to pay attention to any specific metrics? Should I focus on the analytics for our site, our social media, newsletters, a specific platform? I would imagine when they're giving you instructions that this is something that you'll be told, but it just depends what your role is going to be. But these are questions that would be good to have answers to. Key metrics to pay attention to, goals, how you're measuring the goals, and then whatever the logins are. Also, I alluded to this earlier, but depending on the size of your newsroom, you could have so many different options for what you're looking at, what tools they have. You also, depending on your newsroom, you also might only get Google Analytics. It just depends. But there are many different tools and they all have different uses. So again, you guys will get this presentation and you'll be able to reference this, but I always start with a question. And what question are you trying to answer? Do you need to make a decision in real time? Do you want to do a deep dive into your website analytics? Are you wondering a question about social? Why are certain stories performing well but not others? Do you need to analyze competitors? How many metrics can you see at once? Do you want to see a blend of metrics? What question are you trying to answer? And that's when you would go to different tools. Do I want to know something that Chartbeat could tell me or something that Google Analytics could tell me? And these are just some popular tools that many newsrooms tend to have. And you may or may not have access to them, but as long as you know what it is, that will take you a long way. Just know what question you're trying to answer. And then number 3, always start conversations from the data points. So I always give this bit of advice that any analytics platform that you're using, any analytics platform should be the starting point, not the ending point. It should start conversations and you should ask questions. If things don't make sense, ask why of those around you and start conversations. So do keep in mind that every metric has a perspective. And we say that because it's sometimes easy to cherry pick things that either make you look good or make your team look good or something. So that's why it's super important to ask these questions of like, what are the key metrics that I need to pay attention to? What do I have the ability to access? Because if you have all of these metrics to pick from, it's going to completely overwhelm you and totally give you analysis paralysis. You will not know where to start. So I would just ask, what do I need to pay attention to for my objective? What is the success? And how are we going to communicate about this between you and your manager? Because I think it's important to consider this, that if you don't know what you need to focus on, you'll just be confused and that won't be helpful for you or anyone. Also, this is, so I did say the last thing that you should keep in mind is when to give recommendations, or you could also suggest when to stop doing something. This is just a little tip that when you're trying to determine whether or not to continue doing something, and everybody wants less work at this point, you can make this determination of when to stop doing something with what we call the popular important matrix. Is it important or not important? Is it popular or not popular? And then you can determine from there when to either keep doing something or stop doing. This is another tactic you could take when you're analyzing data. Just know, do I need to do all of this? Do some of it, stop doing it. Another step to evaluate content is just asking these questions. This is a similar to that important popular matrix. Does it matter to everyone? Does it matter to a key segment you care about? Can we make it matter to that segment? Change our approach. Is it essential to any other business strategies we have? Is it mission critical anyway? And if it's not to any of those, stop doing whatever that thing is. So again, these are just tips and lists of questions. You can show up and sound very smart if you know how to ask the right questions and get some information that can help your colleagues out. So this is like a progress checklist that we share with newsrooms as a whole. So don't expect, like, don't read this and be like, oh my gosh, I need to be doing all these things in the 6 weeks I'm at a newsroom. Like Jen was saying at the beginning, you may have more of a primer on some of these concepts than colleagues in your newsrooms might have, but I just thought it would be worthwhile to include this just so you can understand that it really is a process, and it's not something that it doesn't always come naturally, and it's not always the most intuitive, but if you just start practicing over and over using these tools and having conversations, and eventually you'll notice that you will start to adopt this culture within yourself, this behavior of using analytics to learn about the audiences that you care about and improve your coverage. The data signals you see in the tool lead you to experiment. And then those experiments answer important audience questions. And then your coverage changes to help you achieve your goals. And then once you reach your goals, that leads to growth and all these other success metrics. But I just wanted to illustrate that this is a progression, and over time, you will learn more and more. But you're not just going to show up on day one and know everything. It's a process, and there's a lot to learn, and it is definitely you could go a lot of different ways. So I just think it's important to get on the same page as your manager and understand where they're coming from as an organization. That way you can be as helpful as you possibly can be. We're really running up.
So
yeah, I was like, that's okay.
No, that's all right. So Katie, if you share the deck, we can, share the deck with everyone. And as those newsrooms learn what systems are they using, Google Analytics, et cetera, and whether or not their jobs will entail going deep into those, we'd love to be able to potentially call you back in for support on that front if folks run into that. We know this is a lot of information, but it hopefully is very helpful, and you can revisit the recording once we post it, and the deck as well, the slideshow. And thank you, Katie. Yeah, she put her email in the chat here as well. We can stay on another couple minutes. Do folks have specific questions? I'll just sum up briefly in that every newsroom uses analytics differently. They all have different things that they value because of their business model and because of their mission. And you'll learn when you talk to your folks that you're working with, what do they value and how can you be helpful in tracking, where you can find that and how you can understand if it's working according to what they're doing. But that metrics are at the end of the day a value judgment, and it's one you're probably not going to win an argument to change in 6 weeks with them if you don't agree with what they're measuring.
Right.
But it's worth knowing there's a ton of different ways to ascribe value to metrics and show your mission through them.
Absolutely. And that's why it's sometimes hard to answer some specific questions at this point when you don't know what platforms you'll be looking at. You don't even know exactly what your role will be. I know I threw a lot at you guys, so if you want to follow up, don't hesitate. You can always email me and I'm happy to help out. And yeah, thank you guys for taking the time to hang out and talk about metrics.
Yeah, any last questions before we sign off?